Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. My name is Jason Freeman, and I'm pleased to be here to welcome Lee Kravetz to our virtual stage. Sylvia Plath wrote, "Nothing stinks like a pile of unpublished writing." Luckily, tonight's author doesn't have to worry about that sort of thing. His acclaimed nonfiction books include Supersurvivors, The Surprising Link Between Suffering and Success, and Strange Contagion, Inside the Surprising Science of Infectious Behaviors of Viral Emotions and What They Tell Us About Ourselves. He has contributed writing to a wide array of publications, including the New York Times, Psychology Today, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Daily Beast. He joins us tonight with The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. In it, he creates three interwoven narratives to reimagine the time in which poet Sylvia Plath wrote her renowned semi-autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar. These three threads follow a present-day auction house curator, the psychiatrist who helped Plath during her darkest days, and a literary rival who pushed her ever closer to the abyss. A review in the San Francisco Chronicle reads thusly: "Where Kravetz really stirs up the magic is in his depictions of the interplay between madness and art." And it also says that he makes a good use of history's rich material to spin a captivating story about some of the art world's most notorious writers and thinkers. So without further ado, Lee, thank you so much for joining us, and I will rejoin you in a little bit for the Q&A. Thanks.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Jason. And I want to thank the Free Library of Philadelphia. I want to thank Andy for having me in. I want to thank Harper Books for all the wonderful things that they've done. Just to get started, you may have originally seen that Joanna Rakoff was going to be joining us tonight. Everything was set to go. Everything was set to go. It was perfect until I got a text from her that she is suffering from COVID, like badly, and she's triple vaxxed and everything. So it hit her pretty hard. So before we do anything else, I want everyone here tonight to put down like a little note in their pad of paper on their calendar. After tonight, go to your social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, look up Joanna Rakoff and send her just a note of feel better. I think that this stuff helps. It has to help, right? So wouldn't it be wonderful if tomorrow morning she wakes up, she feels better, and she looks at it and she has like hundreds and hundreds of people saying, "Feel better, get well soon." So anyways, welcome. Thanks everybody for coming. I am Lee Kravetz. I'm just going to fix my view here a little bit. My name is Lee Kravetz, and this is my debut novel. It's called The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. I have written nonfiction before, but as any nonfiction writer will tell you, you start writing nonfiction so you can hopefully someday become a novelist. And that's sort of where I came from. I've wanted to do this for a very long time. I'm very proud to be here tonight with everybody here. Thank you for coming. I know Joanna would have made this an even more exciting moment. We are going to try to live up to that today. So I'll tell you a little bit about the way this is going to, I think, work. Is I'll tell you a little bit about how I came about the story, a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to read for about 15 minutes, and I'll kind of explain what that's all about once we dive into that. But I thought I'd start by talking about The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. and how in the world a guy in his early 40s decided to write a book about Sylvia Plath. So I started out, actually, like I said, wanting to be a novelist. And I spent into my early 30s trying to write. I had a great education in writing, but I didn't know what to write about. And so when I hit the age of 30, I sat down with my dad, and my dad said to me, "Lee, it's time for you to grow up. This isn't working for you. You need to do something with your life." And he was right. So I decided to go back and get a master's degree in psychology. And so I left New York, where I was living at the time, and I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. I get my master's degree in counseling psychology. And in my postgraduate work, I find myself working in, of all places, a mental hospital. A few years earlier, I'm working in book publishing. I was in marketing and publicity, and here I am now working in a mental hospital. But it's not just any mental hospital. It's coincidentally the same mental hospital that Ken Kesey was working at when he was in grad school. And it inspired him to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was the building that was right next to the building I found myself working in. His building was shut down, really was boarded up, and my building was the one that was now in use. So here I am, I'm working in this ward. And when you walk in, where all the patients are sort of sitting in the sort of lobby area, there was a kiosk with all these paperback books. And all the books that are there are things, like mysteries and suspense novels and, beach reads, basically, to kind of get your mind off of the fact that you're in a mental hospital. But there among them was a copy of The Bell Jar, which on the one hand, it sort of felt like it was the right thing, to find it there. But on the other hand, it felt a little bit strange, because The Bell Jar, for those of you who don't know, it's a thinly veiled story, a memoir, a thinly veiled memoir, but it's fictionalized, of Sylvia Plath's experience when she was a young woman, suffering from what they called manic depression back then. Now we call it bipolar disorder, hospitalized for 6 months at McLean Hospital in Boston, right outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And so the novel really sort of follows, how she, found herself there, and the psychiatrist who helped her, and then her sort of leaving the hospital and living her life a more sort of well-rounded, more fulfilled person, knowing kind of who she is and what she wants to do with her life, very much like Sylvia Plath did. As I'm rereading this book, which I did over a period of about 3 days, it occurred to me that, this wasn't just the story of Sylvia Plath, but this was actually also the story of the birth of a literary movement called confessional poetry. When we think about poetry today, we think about poetry that's raw and sort of has the nitty-gritty details of our thoughts and feelings. It's very personal. In poetry, we call it the personal I. It's very, very self-reflective. But before the late 50s and early 60s, this movement, this confessional poetry movement, did not exist. Beforehand, we had movements like surrealism, we had romanticism, metaphysical, the graveyard poets, we had the cavalier poets, and these poets have been around, and they were born from sort of political movements. They were born from people who were observing nature around them, and history moving around them. But it did not look at the personal sort of experiences of the writer, him or herself. Enter confessional poetry, which was Sylvia Plath's sort of entree into poetry. It was not born in sort of a university or a town, but it was born in a mental hospital. And so was the poetry of Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell, and a number of other poets who came to embody the confessional poetry movement. That was a story that had to be told. That was a story that I really wanted to dive into. And I wanted to go into the thoughts and the hearts and the souls of all of these writers who found themselves sort of in these mental wards in the mid 50s and early 60s, and sort of centered in Boston, Massachusetts, who came out of their experiences and found themselves sitting around a table at Boston University's poetry workshop, which was run by Robert Lowell. That to me sounded like the seeds of a novel. And so that's where we found ourselves, when I sat down and started writing this book. The premise of the novel is pretty simple. It's there's a curator in a modern day auction house, and she is about to retire when these two sort of oafish sort of brothers who flip houses for a living bring her a lockbox. And when she opens the lockbox, she finds 3 notebooks, and she starts to wonder whether or not these might be somehow affiliated with Sylvia Plath, that these might be her notebooks. And this sort of sets her off on a journey of exploration that sort of connects her in really unexpected ways to Sylvia Plath and her legacy. And from there, we look at 2 other storylines. We go back to when Sylvia Plath was first hospitalized when she was about 20 years old at McLean Hospital in 1952. We meet her psychiatrist, who sort of discovers this version of Sylvia who can't read and can't write, and she's having this mental breakdown. And she sort of reteaches her how to hold a pencil and to describe what she's thinking and feeling in a way that no one else has allowed her to do. And that sort of pushes her on her way toward becoming the poet that we know and love today. And then we have a third storyline, which is Sylvia Plath in Robert Lowell's workshop. And she's there and she's learning how to become this wonderful poet, and she's succeeding until she runs into somebody who becomes her literary rival, a poet named Boston Rhodes. And so all three of these storylines sort of kind of bend and weave together. They almost seem like three separate storylines, with the common denominator being Sylvia Plath, until the last third of the novel, where there's sort of a significant seismic shift in the story, and all three storylines kind of careen together in sort of a twist. So that is the novel. And I thought tonight that what I do is give you just a little taste of all three storylines. Typically when I do these sorts of events, I don't like to do a lot of reading, because I think that the interaction, the Q&A, and the conversation is sort of where the engagement is. But I also thought like tonight might be a nice change to sit back and read. So I'm going to read about 2 pages from the introduction of each character as they meet Sylvia Plath for the first time in some way, shape, or form. All right, just bear with me here. Then after this, we can take some questions. We can talk about anything about this book, about Sylvia Plath, about confessional poetry, about anything that you might have. Any questions you have about the weather in San Francisco, I can talk to you about that too. All right, so this first place where I'm starting takes place in 2019. This is Esty, who is the curator of an auction house, and these 2 brothers that it's a JJ and Elton Dice have come in, and they've presented her with this box. So she's sort of exploring this box right now. JJ reaches inside a duffel bag at his feet and lifts out a metal container. He places it on the table between all of us. For a master curator, is there anything more perfect than coming face to face with a closed box? For instance, a seller once showed me a shoebox containing a first edition copy of Victor Hugo's Cromwell. Within a safety deposit box, I found a well-preserved book of hours bordered in illustrations of bright yellow lemons and caterpillars. In a cardboard storage box once, I identified a copy of Julius Caesar dating back to the 17th century. Its pages brown and chipped as though made of thin sheets of clay. It has been this way from the beginning, when I first spied a dark case up in the closet shelf of my home, reached my arms up, stretched my fingers, brought it down to the floor, and opened it to find a black Corona typewriter, my mother's, with its 3 rows of round keys, each one yellow, off yellow, yellowish white with cracked coverings. The typewriter's frame, the corner of the frame, specifically the left corner of the frame, was dented. Mangled, really. What I'm saying is, objects like boxes carry multitudes. What I'm saying is, often when people bring their objects to a curator for its initial appraisal, I still experience a moment of anticipation, of pause before engaging with it. It's these revelatory intangibles that keep me going. What I'm saying is, this is the case with Elton and JJ and the object they've brought me today. A grayish brown container with 2 flimsy handles on its sides. Keeping it shut is the job of a small round lock. Fingerprints break its coating of dust. At this point, the box can hold anything. It just might hold everything. The box looks as though one of the Dice brothers has taken a flathead screwdriver and pried it apart at the lock mechanism. Yeah, we're hoping you can tell us what these are, Elton says, raising the lid. In my sweater pocket, my hands will always find a pair of cloth gloves. I pull them on before removing 3 college-ruled notebooks, one at a time, from the lockbox. Separating the notebook, I lay them side by side on the table. The cover of the black notebook is torn and partially falling off the metal spiral. The blue cover on the second notebook is mostly intact, and written in black ink across the top of the third notebook's green cover are the letters V and L. JJ says that in the house flipping business, when it comes to seeking and locating hidden gems, he and his brother are like truffle pigs with their noses in the dirt. They know promise when they smell it. They're just journals, but I don't know. I mean, they look old, right? Also, the way the box was wedged up there in the attic, Elton adds, it looks like someone put it way up there on purpose. Like it was hidden, JJ says. In my time as a master curator, I've learned the difference between recovered objects and discovered objects. One is lost, the other is buried like a secret, like evidence. And yet all objects that transcend time endure a process of burial, a period of hidden preservation. That is, deceit is part of their makeup. I run 2 fingers across the V and the L drawn in heavy ink on the green cover. Making the shape of an OK sign, I take the cover and open the notebook. The pages are filled with handwriting, small, neat, vivid, and tender. The letters are a mix of block print and cursive. Each word is angled and rendered with consideration like fine stitching. I reach the end of the first sentence and stop reading. I double back, and it's only after I've studied the opening again that I move to the second line and then the third. The pad of my finger traces them like routes along a map, the foreign becoming the oddly familiar. Elton, catching the color rising in my cheek, says, "So, what is it?" I turn and read through more pages. "Well," I say eventually, "it appears as though someone has deliberately transcribed the bell jar." I turn and read through more pages. JJ's expression is lodged somewhere between mild interest and dull curiosity. He scratches his belly under his jersey. What the heck's a bell jar? I know the bell jar, as a classic work of fiction from the mid-20th century, does not exactly fall in line with the more archaic works of my own critical catalog, otherwise procured chronicling the inventory of the Académie des Beaux-Arts or the archives of the Spanish National Library, or even here at the St. Ambrose Auction House. Still, as a book, the bell jar is instantly recognizable to those well-versed in American literature. It is safe to say that the Dice brothers are not. They are no more readers than they are antique book collectors. It's a novel, I say, a pseudo-memoir, really, written roughly 55 years ago. And JJ raises his hand, interrupts at me, and says, "Why would a person transcribe a whole book?" He says that it seems like a real waste of time, and Elton suggests it could be some kid's school project. Either way, I can tell the thought of the object being anything less than authentic in manuscript, an authentic manuscript of historical and therefore high monetary value, is bringing JJ way down. I lean over the table, returning to the open notebook. The text is full of scratched out words and variations of words and words circled and underlined. To me, it reveals a kind of process. In my mind, 2 gears click into place, and quickly I flip back to the front cover and touch my fingers again to the V and the L. The oddly familiar becomes the irrefutable. "Victoria Lucas," I whisper to myself. Elton turns the bill of his cap backward. "Victoria who?" I raise my eyes from the notebook. "Victoria Lucas. It's a pseudonym." JJ looks bewildered, as though I'm speaking in another language. "That means it's a pen name," Elton says flatly, and JJ, wounded, says, "I know what a pseudonym is. I'm asking, whose pseudonym is it?" "Sylvia Plath's," I say. The safe holdings room grows quiet around us, and after a long moment, JJ says, "Okay, I'll bite. Who's Sylvia Plath?" So after we meet the modern storyline, we have a very short section where we meet Boston Rhodes, and we sort of learn a little bit how Boston Rhodes, this is 10 years later, is doing really well as a poet in Robert Lowell's poetry workshop. And she is basically about to become the leader of the confessional poetry movement. That's how good she is, when all of a sudden a new classmate shows up. And this is in the form of a letter that Boston Rhodes is writing to her professor, Robert Lowell. Of course, everybody in your workshop knew who Sylvia Plath was. The presence of the famed poet sent a charge through the room that changed the dynamic, tenor, and chemistry of the practicum. "By the way, Professor Lowell, do you know that your face is perpetually contemplative? It's possibly the most symmetrical face I've ever known, not quite handsome, but attractive in its serene confidence. Yet on the day Sylvia Plath arrived here, I saw the architecture of your bones change shape. What were you thinking in those moments, I wonder? What intoxicating thought was potent enough to crack that stone facade, or for that matter, shatter the order and etiquette of the workshop you'd ingrained into us? When you had us make space for Sylvia at the table, Maxine in our workshop was more than happy to get up and bring her a folding chair from the other classroom. That's right. While I'd fought hard these many months to earn a place among you all, the table just gave Sylvia a seat. And instead of launching into your lecture while perpetually pacing the room, as was your usual way, you addressed the whole workshop from the head of the table directly beside our interloper. Another thing you never let workshop participants do was read their own work aloud. You preferred to pick up one of our poems and recite it, first to yourself and then for our benefit in a low, sometimes frightening rendition. It was the way we did things. You reserved your judgment and allowed the workshop to settle on its own before offering forth your critique. But on that day, you fingered the pages of Sylvia's folio. You chose a poem from it, handed it to Sylvia, and in your soft, dangerous voice said, "Please read this for us." Sylvia stood, the legs of her chair leaving the discolored rug and scraping against the hardwood floor. She was 30 years old, if I had to guess, and outfitted stylishly in a red dress and red French shoes and red matte lips. She had Lauren Bacall's aloof expression of cool observation, her face powdered to lighten the pigeon gray feather gray under her eyes. "Tale of a tub," she said. She lowered the page to her side and began to recite by memory, verse after verse, her tone vital and vibrant, her gaze unblinking. By the fourth stanza, the whole workshop had inhaled like a big pink lung. It was an unusual poem about an equally unusual subject, a bathtub. Yet the workshop clung onto each syllable of Sylvia's recitation. "Succinct," the workshop said. "Perfect," the workshop said. Clearly the work of a major voice, you said, praising the poem from the start. And why not? She was so confident, so self-possessed, so self-assured, as though she were the only person in the room that afternoon. But oh, darling, I was there too, was I not? And I'll end the reading with another very short passage. This one is from the third storyline that takes place even earlier when Sylvia, we meet Sylvia's psychiatrist, who her name is Dr. Ruth Barnhouse. She was a real psychiatrist, and she was one of the first, if not the first, female psychiatrist in New England. This is 1952, and this is from her journal. "I used to play Sinatra records for the Admiral, on the Admiral for my daughter, Tiffany, and I would sing along with them. I can still hear her voice. Her favorite song was Sunflower. She's a sunflower, she's my sunflower, and I know we'll never part. She's a sunflower, she's my one flower, she's the flower of my heart." The song had been on my mind, entrenched there as it were, since the superintendent of the hospital transferred me from Min's Belknap to the ward of Codman Manor. He has proven himself to be a bitter and vindictive man, as small in character as he is in stature. Dr. Busher told me the women's minimum risk ward is far less taxing, but we are both aware that the superintendent has just moved me out of his way. Out of sight is out of mind and out of trouble. Nevertheless, I do find that this mansion I'm in to be quite beautiful. There is a greeting room and a grand staircase that branches off into large hallways, past parlors and reading rooms veneered in ceiling beams and paisley patterned wallpaper. The ward gives one the impression of being inside the hull of a large and luxurious ship. First thing, I took on the task of introducing myself to the women of Codman Manor. Patients, young and old, the helpless and the abandoned, those shuffling through the ward's corridors with vacant cow-like stares. The women wandering with a deluge of detached bewilderment, women who move like sparrows bouncing between fountain pools. As I moved along the first floor corridor, I detected a doleful whistling coming from one patient's room. It was only as I neared the room 19 that is, that my ear deciphered the tune. Sunflower. Glimpsing a girl no older than 20, I saw that my whistler was curled into a rocking chair. The toes of her slippers poked out of a red wool blanket. Her hair was chopped short, pelt-like and patchy. Another woman was in the room with her, I noticed, dressed in pearls, white gloves, and a wide-brimmed structured hat. The other woman was, in fact, fussing over a vase of sunflowers. The girl in the rocking chair seemed to hold no more strength than those cut stems. When I got around to asking Nurse Edme the name of the patient in room 19, she said, "Who? Oh, Miss Plath. Well, she's only the most infamous girl in New England." All right. So I will leave it there, and maybe Jason can come back and we can start taking some questions.
Hey, yeah, thank you for the description, and thank you for those readings. And as questions start to come in, I'll once again encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A tab. I was wondering about something, and I'd like to get the ball rolling. So no spoilers from here, because I just got a digital copy of the book today and I started reading it and I'm enjoying it so far. And the first thing I noticed, there is a quote by Boston Rhodes, in the beginning. And I found that I was like, wait, who's real? Who's a real person here? Who is a fiction? And I always find that to be very interesting in literature when people do this. Could you talk a little bit about blurring those lines and, reactions from people who are like, wondering about this unknown poet and that sort of thing, and maybe the joys and even the difficulties of writing about that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great observation. You're actually the first person I've done an interview with who's pointed that out. And I'm glad you did, because so Boston Rhodes is a purely fictional character. There are real people. This novel is sort of reality adjacent, I would say. We run into Sylvia Plath, we run into Robert Lowell, who's a real person. Maxine Kumin, who's another poet, is a real person. Ted Hughes is a real person. But the majority of these characters are fiction, or they're composites of real people that have been fictionalized. Boston Rhodes is a figment of my imagination based on multiple people, but the most prevalent poet is Anne Sexton. So you'll see her DNA written all over Boston Rhodes, but Boston Rhodes herself is a fairly complex and sort of vindictive and vicious character. Very much Sylvia Plath's equal and opposite in every way. And we can kind of hold both of those images in our head at the same time. In order to write her fully, though, I had to show the kind of poetry that she's writing. And so I thought, well, what a wonderful way to sort of to show what she's doing and, see her observations and understand where she's at any given point in the novel. Each of the section heads actually has pieces of her poetry, and the poems themselves are completely fictional as well. I am not a poet, but one of the ways that I got to know these characters, it's sort of like method acting. I spent, there's three major point of view characters, and each one of them, I think I spent probably 11 months inhabiting. In as much as a method actor can, method writing is sort of similar, I sort of find. And when I was writing through her and her voice, I knew exactly how she would write, exactly what she would say, and exactly the sort of angle she would come at. So it wasn't that difficult to sort of come up with these sort of snippets of poems that actually have significance within the novel themselves. So there's a letter that she's writing. The letter becomes significant later in other storylines. Poems that appear in one storyline wind up in some other storyline, and each one sort of informs the next. Boston Rhodes is very much in the driver's seat of this novel, though.
Cool. Well, you mentioned Anne Sexton. Would you say that her DNA is kind of central? I know they had a relationship. Was that relationship, did you find it? I mean, is it well known that it's contentious, or was it kind of a frenemy situation, or what?
Yeah, so it's great. So I think, if you read the letters between the two of them and the poems between the two of them, and there were poems between the two of them, it was absolutely a relationship built on mutual respect. but within that, there was absolutely, you could tell there was an edge, there was a rivalry between them. And you can see this both in the letters that they write to each other. In the poems, they would communicate to each other almost in code. Sylvia would write a poem, let's say, about bees or beekeeping, and Anne Sexton would write a series of poems about bees and beekeeping. And so they were sort of talking to each other, answering each other's sort of jabs at each other, but also not so much jabs, but just the way that they conversed with each other was not just simply through words, but through the written word as well. One of the themes of this novel is how we need rivalry to create some of the finest works of art. And there's different examples that we can always go back to, and which we do in the novel. But Sylvia needs Boston Rhodes needs Sylvia, and we see how that sort of relationship intertwines. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter as the story goes on, for better and for worse.
So thanks for that. So we have some questions from the audience here. I'll just go mainly down the line here. So Ariel Musgrave says, I just learned about this event and I'm so excited. There's a novel about Sylvia Plath. There seems to be a small industry devoted to analyzing her life and work, but not synthesizing, and this is kind of what we were discussing a little bit, but not synthesizing either into fiction. Why do you think that is? Too sacred, simple fear, too soon? I mean, yeah, 1963, too soon.
It's a great question.
But why does that seem to be sort of a holy cow for some people?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think it's a great question, right? Like, why is everything so, it's all nonfiction? Part of it is, I mean, look, when I sat down to write about Sylvia Plath, and I'm prefacing this by saying this is not a spiritual sort of thing for me when I was doing it. But I sat down with her in my mind, in my heart, and I said, listen, I'm going to write a novel about you with you in it. And I want to do this right. And I want to do it fairly. When you're writing about real people, I think we have an obligation to portray them fairly and accurately, even if the beats of the story or the dialogue is fiction. And if you do that and do it well, then I think you have every right to take these holy cows, as you say, and spin them into fiction. Sylvia Plath lives it lives in my psyche, definitely, but I think in the psyche of millions of readers, and has since the 1960s. So for almost 60 years now. And I think she lives there because we relate to her in almost every way. She relates to us. She tells us what we're thinking and feeling because it's what she's thinking and feeling. And those things haven't changed over 60 years. I think we sort of place a mythology around her, and touching that mythology through fiction can be a little bit daunting. I think if I had really thought about it when I first started, I might not have actually written about Sylvia Plath, because it is such a daunting thing. You don't want to sully the reputation of somebody. You don't want to misshape it or portray it in a way that's not accurate. And by the way, Sylvia Plath just happens to be one of the most iconic poets and writers and women of the 20th century, and certainly the 21st century. So, you're taking a big risk by touching the legacy, or touching on the legacy of these sort of people and turning them into characters. I think the job of a writer is to do that as fairly and accurately as possible. I hope I did it well. I think I did it pretty okay, but you guys help be the judge of that.
I think it's great so far, and the reviews are certainly excellent too.
Thank you.
So Lisa Robinson writes, I have not read anything by Sylvia Plath. What should I read first? I'll plan to read your book beforehand. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for this. So the Bell Jar, obviously. So a quick bibliography of her, maybe, for people initiated.
You got it. So actually, I wrote this novel so that anybody who does not know who Sylvia Plath is would be okay. I really wanted The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. to be an introduction to who she was, so that when or if you decide to dive into Sylvia's work, it adds a level of depth and three-dimensionality to it in a way that you know, didn't come before, you didn't have before. That said, I mean, The Bell Jar is obviously her classic novel. She was a poet her whole life. She actually wrote her first poem around the age of 8. It was published. She got her first poem published at the age of 12. I mean, this is somebody who lived and breathed poetry. She was amazing at it. This was natural for her. She was, it was just intuitive and absolutely beautiful. Let me fix my light here. And she was really good at it. She wrote poetry all the way through her 20s. It was well known, but not really that well known. She writes The Bell Jar at the age of 30, and 6 months later dies by suicide. After that, her work starts to come out in drips and drabs. Her widowed ex-husband, because they had separated at this point, a very famous poet named Ted Hughes, starts to posthumously publish her work and get it out there. The Bell Jar starts to gain more of a reputation. Her poetry, Ariel, comes out. Other collections come out, and her poetry just takes off, and she becomes the Sylvia Plath, like I say, that we all know and love today. If you want to get a good start, I would absolutely read Ariel, her collection. It's one of her first collections of poetry. Super simple, really just stunning. Her descriptions of life and death, of motherhood, her thoughts on her deceased father, marriage in general, living overseas, her biography. You can read her biography by basically reading the poetry out of Ariel. And then, of course, The Bell Jar, which is a very straightforward sort of narrative about, growing up a young woman in the 1950s. Again, it's straightforward, but it's brilliant. Like, the brilliance of The Bell Jar, in my mind, since you're asking, the brilliance of The Bell Jar is, it's not in the story itself. The story is a fairly simple story. It's a memoir, like any memoir we'd read today, where you have somebody who struggles, gets better, and comes out a different person in the end. But that's not the beauty. The beauty is actually in how she shows us what she's going through. Famously, in the middle of the novel, Sylvia's main character, Esther Greenwood, which is sort of a stand-in for her, is hospitalized for having a manic breakdown. And then she goes to the hospital and she meets all these characters and comes out a healed woman. But she's so brilliant at what she does and getting into Esther Greenwood's head that we don't realize that she's actually having a manic break starting on page 1. She's so good at bringing us into her world and into her point of view that it is stunning to us that by the time she actually is hospitalized, she's been, for over 100 pages suffering this mental break, and we are with her every step of the way. That's what makes her so brilliant. She was able to step into a character, her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in a way that very few people have even today.
Yeah. It always feels like, the cliche of turning the heat on with the toad and the water, and it's just heated, and you're like, oh man, yeah, it's scorching in here.
That's exactly it.
So a questioner, I like to think this is this person's name, Mr. Collector.
Okay.
Said, you must have been agog when Harper agreed to publish your book. Were they your first only choice for submission? I would only add to that, you were talking a moment ago about, choosing the subject matter and would you do that? And the daunting task. Can you talk about this book coming into being? And I mean, was there a single, impetus, or was there something like that? And then, was there a response from publishers, the literary community about, again, somebody that is so, set in marble at this point?
It was such an interesting experience. So I wrote this book. Like I said, I was very, if I had been more aware, I probably wouldn't have done it, but I'm really glad I did. And so the true story is, this is the honest truth. My agent, my wonderful agent, said to me, because I had done nonfiction before, what's your next nonfiction book going to be about? And I said, I'm not going to write a nonfiction book. I want to write a novel. And he stopped me right there in my tracks. And he said, Lee, and he's very thoughtful. He says, Lee, don't write a novel. And I said, well, why not? And he goes, because every nonfiction writer wants to be a novelist. And I said, yeah, well, I'm one of them. And he said, okay, well, let's see what you got. I turned in my first draft to him, and he called me up and he said, okay, this is going to be your first novel. So we knew that there was something going on here. The story was coming alive. The story needed to be told, and it was shaping up really nicely. After about 2.5 years later, once the novel's, the manuscript is complete, I actually, my agent and I both knew there was only one place to sell it. I mean, other people, if we were lucky, would look at it, but in my mind, there was only one publisher that I wanted to sell this to, and that I wanted to get their approval from, and I wanted them to go out with it. It was Harper, and the reason is Harper has been sort of the safe holdings box, if you will, of Sylvia's legacy for almost 50 years now. Every piece of poetry that comes out, every book that she wrote, every sort of reissue that is done, every sort of examination of her letters and an academic book that comes out, they have preserved her legacy beautifully. And I knew that Harper was, I wanted them to do the same for this book as well. There are other publishers, of course, that do publish stuff about Sylvia Plath. Red Comet was published by a different publisher, which came out last year, won the Pulitzer. It's a beautiful book. But I knew that Harper was the one that I really, really wanted to sort of champion this book. And I'll be honest, the minute that we sort of started talking to them, they got on board really quickly, because I think that they wanted to sort of project this image of Sylvia as well, based on, how the novel sort of moves forward. You get to see that it's about her past, her present, her legacy. And what I tried to do was that I didn't want to focus on Sylvia's death. So much of her sort of body of work and the academic sort of body of work that comes out, the biographies now and things like that, they focus on, the promise, but they also end in the tragedy of her life. And I wanted to celebrate, while acknowledging the death and what leads to it, I really wanted to celebrate her legacy and how important, she continues to be for, the people who read her today, and generations of them as well in the past. I felt that was really, really important. And I think that Harper got on board simply because it really did project a story of hope, rather than simply a story of tragedy.
Right. And, it's something I was thinking about as you were talking, and even the questions that are coming in here too, not dwelling on the circumstances of her death, but, the circumstances of her life and her writing and all that too, which is,
Oh my God. I mean, that's the thing about Sylvia. Her poetry is all about life. Even the dark stuff, it is about life. It's about the nitty gritty, dirty, uncomfortable things, confessional poetry. I have a list here of all these things that confessional poetry really talks about. It's lust, it's death, abortion, incest, grief, childhood, motherhood, fatherhood, all of these things. I mean, these are so human. Those things don't represent, in my mind, tragedy. What they represent is life and living. So she really, she blew life up on her pages. I mean, that's, take a look at any poem in Ariel. Like I said earlier, and you will see how she just embraces life.
There's a question here from Emily Cook, and I couldn't agree with you more, Emily. I always loved the device of discovered treasure. Did you start with the idea of the recovered journals or discover this device in the course of writing?
That's a great question. So, right, the MacGuffin. I knew that there was going to be a MacGuffin. I didn't know exactly how the MacGuffin was going to work, but as soon as I landed on it, I knew how the story was going to end. And so once I locked in on that, the whole thing came together. So that was really fairly early on. If we're getting into the nitty gritty of how to, how this novel sort of is put together, it's like gears of a clock. There's 3 storylines, and each storyline sort of interlinks in very sort of unique ways and unexpected ways. And for every storyline to sort of work and push the next one forward, there had to be sort of this momentum, this drive. So I knew early on that there had to be a reason that each of these characters was moving forward in the story. finding these notebooks in a lockbox and trying to figure out where they came from, why they were there in the first place, and the significance of those became something I was really excited to explore also, with the understanding that I knew exactly where those notebooks were going to go at the very end.
Right. And you know, kind of reading it and hearing you read, and is it two brothers who own the conservator, and so hearing that and reading that today, it also sort of feels like a larger, and I'm loath to say meta, but a larger way of, you know, bringing Sylvia Plath to uninitiated people and looking at her legacy now. And again, sort of looking at her and how lionized she, you know, and it is this delicate thing that you find, you know, in the past from her. It seems like a great way of showing, you know, her legacy and still how towering she is in that regard.
I love it, Jason. That's a really good point. I mean, you know, Ruth Barnhouse is a character that sort of shapes Sylvia Plath when she's young. Boston Rhodes is a character who shapes Sylvia Plath as she starts to write the Bell Jar 10 years later. These brothers who find the notebooks, and more specifically, the curator of the auction house who comes into possession of these notebooks before trying to sell them. That I felt it was more like me, and it was more like the lay reader. You know, she asks a question early on in the novel, like, what's the significance of Sylvia Plath today? 60 years ago, she was alive. This book came out, you know, more than half a century ago. How in the world is this significant to today? And all of a sudden she starts, you know, going down this rabbit hole, and you realize just how significant she is today and why she matters. And that was me. I mean, as I'm digging into this story, trying to figure out, well, wow, did she really do this? And wow, you know, we wouldn't have the poetry we have today if it weren't for her. We wouldn't have memoir if it weren't for her. We wouldn't have rock music. We wouldn't have the folk music that we listen to today. We wouldn't have, I even think we wouldn't have, like, you know, 90s grunge music if it weren't for her, because she was the one who first began to, again, talk about thoughts and feelings in a way that was so personal. And I think once we realized we could do that, then art changed forever.
Yeah, I had the thought today of going through Spotify and just seeing how many songs had Sylvia Plath in the title.
Just alone, right?
Yeah. So Ronit Trumkin, apologies if I mispronounced your name. And we are getting in the weeds here. This is getting in the weeds of process, but you said you spent 11 months with each character. Would you discuss your creation timeline and why 11 months? Yeah. Was it research? Was it, you know, amalgamating these characters together?
Yeah, it's funny. I do. So each draft of the book, my process seems to be that I work on a draft of the book. It takes about 10 to 11 months to do a draft of the book. And in this particular case, it was almost like 3 separate novels that I had to write and then merge them together. So I stayed in character. You know, when I talk about method writing, I stayed in character for each draft. And so when I was getting to know Boston Rhodes, I literally dictate into my phone almost as though I'm using her vocal tones, and I get into who she is and how she's thinking, how she's seeing the world. And I do that for that draft about 11 months. And that's how I sort of refine who the voice is and who these characters are. And I find empathy the way that you would need to as a reader as well, want to find empathy even with the most despicable of characters. You know, Ruth Barnhouse, her Sylvia's psychiatrist when she's you know, younger, was somebody who was very rigid and not artistic in any way, shape, or form, but she was also somebody who was struggling mightily with you know, the patriarchy of being the only female in a male-dominated hospital. You know, pushing these new ideas out into the world and coming up against opposition across the board. How would a person like that deal with, you know, meeting somebody like Sylvia Plath at 19? So that was about another 11-month process. And it was the hardest character was actually the more modern storyline, because it was more similar to who I was. And then at some point I realized if I just asked the questions that I naturally would, that character would come alive also. So it took, about what, I can't do math, 33 months to actually get, really the first solid draft of the book. And then from there, everything starts spinning and turning together. And you start making the connections between all three storylines.
Right. Well, you're a writer. We don't do math.
Math.
And this is an interesting question. I don't know if it's just semantics or this means something specific to you, but Sri Nandhini says, "Hello, sir. Why are these poets called confessional rather than self-revelatory?"
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's splitting hairs, but I think it's an interesting.
It's a great question. Actually, if you look at the original critiques of confessional poetry, which were, I mean, some people thought it was wonderful, a revelation. But if you look at like the traditional critics of poetry, they did call it self-revelatory poetry. They called it, and they did not say it in a nice way. They meant, please keep this to yourself. The sentiment being, the public doesn't need to be your therapist. We don't need to hear your thoughts and feelings and process and your guilt. We don't need that. Keep it to yourself. Talk about the birds and the bees and the sky and things like that, but keep it to yourself. The intimate stuff. Confessional poetry became confessional poetry because it was about self-confession, but it was also encouraging, I think, the reader to confess their connection to the poem as well. I read this and I see myself in it. Look, you read this book and you see that there are three female protagonists. I am clearly not a female. I am not somebody who sees myself or shouldn't see myself in Esther Greenwood, Sylvia Plath's sort of composite character of herself. And yet I do. Every poem that I read of Sylvia Plath, I see myself in. I'm not kidding when I say that Sylvia Plath is all of us, because she talks about what makes us all human. We all have the same sort of innate desires and feelings and about life, even if we see them somewhat differently.
Thank you. So folks, enter a few more questions. We have some more time. We'd love to get to those. And this is actually a great segue into something I was personally wondering about too in the book. And we've sort of been hitting on some of it. And we were talking about the South before we came on, and I'm interested in that. And there's the sentimental, heartbroken redneck writer, or the very Faulknerian, sad person, and the idea of the connection between art and mental illness.
Yep.
Is nothing new. And I mean, I always think of Van Gogh when I think of that, of somebody translating, all of their fury and sadness and passion, into this one other thing. And I think you can't obviously separate it when Sylvia Plath is involved. I mean, do you, and obviously mental illness is not new to the 20th century, but I think it's when people started really addressing it in their work. What's that connection you find between, the artist and mental? I know that's a really huge question.
It's not actually, it's a great question. It's actually I think it's the fundamental question. So I think you hit the nail on the head. What's the connection between mental illness and art? What's the connection? There's obviously one, right? If you look at the anguished poet, the anguished, painter, the anguished novelist, I can tell you, because I looked into this because I was curious too. The research shows, this is kind of weird, but it's true. There is no logical connection. There is no connection between madness and art, with a few exceptions. One, bipolar disorder, which is what Sylvia Plath had, what Robert Lowell had, what Anne Sexton had, and what many poets and artists and many people who give us some amazing art suffer from. And I have to, I don't know why, but I know that, when those are suffering from bipolar, we have the manic highs and the deep, deep lows with no sort of container to hold that back. And most of the times when we're experiencing those highs and lows, they come out as coherent thoughts. And even if they're incoherent, we can put them on the page or in paintings and we can see that experience, which I think is true. The other thing, and this is slightly different, but along the same sort of conversation topic. I'm not a Freudian therapist. I don't, I was not like a psychodynamic theory, sort of therapist when I was practicing. But I will tell you that Freud was onto something when he said that we have defense mechanisms. We do. We have these, deflection, projection, denial, all of these things to sort of protect us from the pain and hurt that we feel in life. There's one that is actually good for us. And the one that's good for us is called sublimation. And the idea behind sublimation is that when we are feeling defensive and hurt and broken, we actually pour all of that into art, specifically art. So sublimation is also something that encourages us to take our thoughts and feelings and pour them into things creatively. And then there's one that I've sort of figured out on my own, which I don't know how much science is behind it, but I feel like when we're creating, when we're writing, in particular, when I'm writing, there's nothing closer to madness than actually sitting down and inventing, out of whole cloth, rooms and filling those rooms with people and dialogue that doesn't exist. And then, putting it on the page and selling it as a book. I mean, there's something kind of inherently mad about that as well. So I think that that's really where you're going to see that connection between art and madness.
Yeah, I'm glad there's a name for all of the mopey art that we did when we were teenagers, and the mopey art we're doing today as well.
I love mopey art. I love mopey art.
Hey. Oh yeah, some shoegaze anytime.
That's great.
So Ivy says, and I feel like I'm going to go down a Wikipedia reading hole with this afterwards. The number of artists that have stayed at McLean alone: James Taylor, Ray Charles, etc. What's the deal?
What's the deal? You know what? That's a great question. What gives? James Taylor actually openly talks about spending time there. I think part of it is he was local. And part of it was, I think in the 60s and 70s, it suddenly became sort of I'm not saying it was trendy to do it, but I think that it was more open. People were more open to saying, I need to check myself in. I'm having, suffering from exhaustion. I'm suffering from, deep, deep depression. I need to check myself in. And it wasn't so much a badge of honor, but it was more like it was more acceptable because more people were doing it. And certainly starting with Sylvia Plath's novel, novels of the like, you start seeing more and more characters spending more time in mental hospitals. So the more you see it happen, the more acceptable it becomes. I also know that a lot of these musicians and artists did spend a lot of time in McLean Hospital, partly because, Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Stockbridge, Massachusetts, there was just it seemed to be just sort of a cluster of artistic sort of talent. Sometimes we get that, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we had the beatniks that came from New York, and they sort of congregated in downtown San Francisco, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and all of that. So, I think that you have these little pockets of artists that sort of pop up, certainly around that time. And a lot of them did have mental illness issues, if not mental illness issues, drug issues, serious drug issues. All of those, well, if you're suffering from that, you go to the hospital. And I think that's exactly what happened with McLean. But McLean Hospital is absolutely one of the more storied mental asylums in the country, specifically because so many artists have spent time there.
Right. There should have been a bus from the Chelsea Hotel.
Oh my God. That's a great idea. You know what? That might be the sequel. Maybe I'll write it.
Right. The bus from the Chelsea. Yeah, long title.
Exactly.
And I think this is and it's the last question in the box. So there's a good symmetry here. And it's a great question to end on, kind of looking at now. Lynn Van Auken asked, do you think there are any poets, writers publishing today who will be or are the equivalents of Sylvia Plath for our 20 and 30 somethings?
God, that is a brilliant question. And I don't think I have an answer for that, except to say, and this is not really an answer, so I apologize, that Sylvia Plath's influence, I think, touches every writer that's out there, even if they've never read her. And that's because we all now know that we have the permission to go raw, to go really deep and dark and personal. I don't know if there's actually, right now I'm reading a book, How High We Go in the Dark. And I'm going to butcher the author's name. In fact, I don't know if I have it here, but it's, you know, brilliant fiction. And it is speculative fiction, but it is, I mean, it touches this raw nerve. Tommy Orange, he's not a poet, he's a writer. They're all writers, but he's a novelist. I think that he has the potential because he talks about the personal I, even in that fictional realm. You know, as far as poets go, yeah, this is, I'll be honest, I'm actually not a poet, and I don't follow poetry nearly as much as many other people, you know, do. I think that I wish I had a better answer for this, but I will say that I don't think that there's a single novel that I pick up today that doesn't have some sort of the DNA that is Sylvia Plath somewhere on the page.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I think it's like that thing that there's a thing someone said about Hemingway where he is a mountain, and either you're looking at the mountain, you're standing on the mountain looking off, you're trying not to look at the mountain, or you've had the mountain described to you so many, you know, that it's always just this central thing.
That's exactly it. It's just there. That's the brilliance of Sylvia Plath. And I really hope that I was really, you know, I did her justice by sort of showing that sort of omnipresent sort of spirit that is in all of us and all of the work that we read today.
Yeah. Well, it was a great answer because Lynn says, love that. Thank you. So, and
I did it. Yeah.
I think, I hope I can speak for everybody else. I totally concur. Lee, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So it is what, 5:30 in California. You've got your daylight savings, and yeah. So it's the last Confessions of Sylvia P. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you. And everybody, seriously, whoever's still here, go on to Joanna Rakoff's social media, blast her with just good spirits and get well wishes. And guys, thank you so much. I want to thank again the Free Library of Philadelphia, Jason, Andy, all of you guys, and Harper in particular for helping set this whole thing up as well.
All right, Lee. Thank you so much. Have a great night, and good night to you out there, and we'll see you at the next one. All right. Thanks again.
Thanks for coming, guys. Take care.